These pyrotechnic rockets, photographed during the victory celebrations in London in 1946, represented to the vast majority of people in this country the meaning of the word rocket prior to the outbreak of war in 1939. But the results of German rocket development work, which became all too apparent towards the end of the war, showed that in some aspects of rocket technology they had forged right ahead of every other country. Yet in 1918 the Germans were no further forward in this subject than anyone else. How then did this apparently sudden advance come about during the period between the wars? How far had they gone by 1945? This film is intended to give some answers to these questions. To illustrate how an idea can develop from very humble beginnings, a short review of the progress of the aeroplane is shown. Few people at the turn of the century, seeing Otto Lilienthal, shown here, and other early pioneers in the study of aeronautics, would have believed that in less than 50 years the aeroplane would develop to its present state of efficiency. Here are the Wright brothers, famous for being the first men to fly a heavier-than-air machine at Kitty Hawk Sands in 1903. And here Blériot, who won the distinction of being the first man to fly the English Channel, and who firmly believed, even in these early days, that the monoplane would permanently replace the biplane. These early pioneers, for the most part enthusiasts with little technical backing, were treated with much disbelief and ridicule. Yet, by their persistence, these men proved their ideas to be practical, and established the importance of the heavier-than-air machine. With the outbreak of the First World War, the need for efficient aeroplanes was soon realized, and during the war years much progress was made in the improvement of aircraft. Here are a few examples of aircraft of this period. An early British heavy bomber, the famous Gotha bomber, with an albatross under the wing. During the years of peace that followed, aircraft designers, aided by the experience gained during the war, set to work to produce more efficient machines, and we see the aeroplane develop from a mass of struts and bracing to clean aerodynamical lines. An early forebearer of the Junkers 52. The Dornier Wahl shows a considerable improvement over its ancestors, as does the world-famous Dornier DOX, an attempt to build a flying wing, but without success, and the designer added a normal fuselage and tail to make it into a more orthodox aircraft. The Heinkel 111, originally designed as a civil machine, but readily convertible into a bomber. The Douglas DC-2, elder brother of the famous Dakota, and the Focke-Wulf Condor, another of Germany's civil machines readily converted into a bomber. When the Second World War started in 1939, the aeroplane had already reached a high peak of efficiency. Some German military aircraft at this period are shown here. The Heinkel 113, an unsuccessful competitor to the Messerschmitt 109, Germany's standard single-seater fighter. The Focke-Wulf 190, an improved single-seater fighter. And the Junkers 188, a late operational aircraft used by the Germans before the advent of jet propulsion. And so, having watched the aeroplane develop from a primitive machine into an established mode of transport and a weapon of war, we now go to the rocket, our main theme, to the early primitive rocket of the 1920s. Here is a typical example of early experiment. The rockets attached to the skater's back were calculated to propel him along at a considerable speed, but the experiment proved little. Except perhaps that rockets get hot when they burn. Experiments were also carried out using rockets on a motorbike, and it is believed that these were reasonably successful. Here is a picture of one of these bikes in action. In America, a courageous youth conceived the bright idea of attaching solid fuel rockets to a motorboat. Off we go, but apart from putting up a first-class smoke screen, our young friend's efforts were not successful. An experiment carried out in Czechoslovakia to illustrate the principle of reaction propulsion is interesting because of its relationship to rocket power, which is also reaction propulsion. This boat, in which water is being forced out of nozzles at the sides, demonstrates the speed and degree of maneuverability that may be attained if the propulsion unit can be properly controlled. The effect here is similar to that experienced by a fireman holding a fire hose. The reaction to the jet of water coming out of the nozzle exerts a considerable force on him, and a large hose often takes 2 men to hold. Among the uses to which the solid fuel rocket has been successfully applied is that of life-saving at sea. This rocket, which functions in the same manner as the ordinary firework rocket, is used to carry a light line to the ship in distress, enabling a heavier line to be hauled aboard and rescue subsequently effected. In 1928, a series of experiments were begun by Faillier, Opel and Sander to discover the characteristics of solid fuel rockets and to examine the possibilities of this form of propulsion. A number of cars were built using solid fuel as the propulsion agent. Here is one that achieved a speed of 112 miles an hour. These pictures show the car in action, and it is noted that the wings were fitted to keep the car on the ground. Slow motion pictures show the difference between the jet exhaust velocity and the speed of the car, an indication of poor efficiency. In all these experiments, black powder is the rocket propellant used, hence the large clouds of smoke. To carry further the experiments, and in order to get higher speeds, a number of rail cars were built. Most of these suffered mishaps of some sort, but it is a tribute to the tenacity with which the experimenters tackled the problem that they carried on in spite of the repeated failures. Here is a trial to test the effect of acceleration on animal life. In this case, the results were rather unfortunate for the cat, as the car blew up. More rail cars were built by Opel and Sounder, still working on the same lines. In one case, the car blew up at the start, and in another the car left the rails owing to a rocket becoming loose in the rocket housing, the effect of which can be seen here. Velkart also built a car, this being constructed on slightly different lines. The rockets were mounted in rows, fired one after another. He too achieved some success. Although the venture appears somewhat dangerous in places. All these pictures of rocket, road and rail cars are included to give you some idea of the amount of work carried out in Germany on this subject. In April 1929, he made further demonstration runs with his car at Nuremberg. After separated from Opel and Sounder, he constructed, in cooperation with Eisfeld, several more rail cars of a simpler nature. These achieved speeds of up to 112 miles an hour, but mostly suffered violent ends for various reasons. It will be seen that the story of the aircraft is being repeated. Small, enthusiastic groups with little technical backing, again being treated with the same mixture of curiosity and skepticism. This car reached a speed of 112 miles an hour and was then given a second acceleration, estimated to increase the speed to 190 miles an hour. But unfortunately, the car left the rails. Much to the consternation of the chap in the field at the back. In February 1929, Failure built a rocket sledge and tried it out on the Eibsee. The lesson learned from these experiments was that the short duration and uncontrollability of burning made solid fuel rockets unsuitable for many purposes, although the power required was there. In April 1931, a seeker after notoriety, who had obviously carried out little basic work on rocket propulsion, sought to emulate Failure, but with very indifferent results. An obvious use to which the rocket could be applied was the transporting of mails at high speed. Reinhold Tilling designed this rather unusual rocket for this purpose. When the propellant is exhausted, two of the vanes spring out and become wings, enabling the rocket to spiral to Earth. Here again black powder is used as the propellant. The first German postal rocket was fired by Tilling, and the mails, in this case 180 postcards, are inserted in the nose of the rocket. Launching is effected from a pole, the motor being fired electrically. Tilling's rocket caused considerable interest, and a public demonstration was given in 1931 at Meffert. The rocket seen here is a larger version of the postal rocket and is made of metal, whereas the former was wooden, the principles of operation being the same. The rocket is set on the launching rail and fired from an almost vertical position. ends, the rocket appears slightly unstable, and when it reaches its zenith, the vanes spring out and the spiral to Earth begins. In 1934, a German, Gerhard Zucker, came to England and, backed by a London stamp dealer, carried out some trials with postal rockets. The last of these trials, which were permitted but not backed by the General Post Office, was this attempt to fire from Lymington to the Isle of Wight. This was a failure, and further trials were stopped by the Home Office, owing to the danger to the public. In Germany, Zucker again attempted to solve the problem of a transport rocket with this large capacity cylinder to which rockets were attached. A match is applied, and the transport rocket takes to the air, though not for very long. Reinhold Tilling, the designer of the gliding rocket seen earlier, also designed rockets for military purposes. These rockets, as can be seen, closely resemble our own aircraft rockets, and are in fact operated on much the same principle, except that black powder is used as the propellant. Tilling, who was later killed whilst pressing powder, achieved excellent results with his rockets, despite the fact that he used very crude equipment. For instance, he used a pair of kitchen scales, suitably coupled, to measure thrust. In 1933 and 34, Richard Tilling, who carried on his brother's work after his death, demonstrated a rocket fired from an aircraft. The firing trials were carried out at a height of 1,800 feet and ranges of 7,500 to 8,500 yards obtained. These pictures show the stability and flatness of trajectory obtained with Tilling's rocket. In 1928, after a considerable amount of research by Beck, Torthausen and Lippisch, the Ron Rossiter Company built a full-sized aircraft powered by solid-fuel black powder rockets developed by Sander. This aircraft had a lot of teething troubles, the first few attempted takeoffs being unsuccessful. But eventually, as will be seen in a moment, the aircraft became airborne and made a short flight across the aerodrome. This is a picture deserving special attention, as it is the first rocket-propelled aircraft ever flown, and it should be noted that this event took place as far back as 1928. Slow motion picture of the flight. Goddard, working in America, in 1926 fired this first liquid fuel rocket into the air, using liquid oxygen and petrol as fuel. Winkler, in Germany, formed one of several groups who took up the research into liquid fuels for rocket propulsion. Winkler's workshop and test benches may be seen here. He decided on liquid oxygen and liquid methane as fuels, and built a series of rockets using these two agents. The HW-1, Winkler's first rocket, was a very small affair, and here may be seen the preparations for launching. The rocket is the small white object in the centre of the picture. After the failure of the HW-1, Winkler built another on the same lines, the HW-1A. This also was a failure. His next was the HW-2, which was intended to reach the stratosphere and bring back meteorological information. On the day of the launching, in October 1932, Winkler and co. drink to the success of the rocket. A cutaway picture of the HW-2 is shown here, illustrating the layout of the fuel tanks and combustion chamber. A large number of curious onlookers assembled at the starting point to witness the launch. Here is one of the fuels preparatory to being put in the rocket. The Met section was out in force. Here the fuse is attached, and the German Navy takes a quick look round to ensure that all is above board. The cameramen taking these pictures have obviously had some experience of this sort of thing before, as they came well prepared. The cause of the mishap was a leak of fuel into the case, which caused an explosion when the rocket was ignited, causing the mechanism to be separated from the outer case. Undeterred, Winkler set about finding the cause of the failure. Now we come to the American attempt to build a rocket-propelled pilotless aeroplane to carry mails across Greenwood Lake on the borders of New York and New Jersey. Liquid oxygen and petrol were used as the fuel. The liquid fuel motor is ignited by the gent in the asbestos suit, and the aircraft takes off, but doesn't go very far. The failure was caused by the deliberate twisting of the oxygen fuel pipes by a disgruntled mechanic who had been dismissed by the company. Another trial, but this time the plane had little more ambition than the first, and attempts to take itself off. With rather disastrous results. In Germany, the group of workers under Obert and his pupils Nabel and von Braun were convinced of the possibilities of long-distance transport rockets. Their early work was really the beginning of the famous V2 rocket development. And here is a picture of Nabel and von Braun with some very early rockets. To return to failure, working with the firm Haylant, he built a rocket car using liquid fuels. This was tested at the Haylant works and ran for several minutes. A demonstration was given in April 1930. In May 1930, failure was killed in an explosion whilst carrying out tests. But Haylant decided to continue the experiments and, in collaboration with Peach, built a larger car on the same lines, seen here in the final stages of construction. The fuels used in these cars were liquid oxygen and petrol. Some of the advantages of liquid rocket fuels, more even burning, extension of burning time for as long as the fuels are fed into the combustion chamber, ease of regulation of fuel supply and alteration of thrust, greater freedom in design and construction, such as the placing of fuel tanks in any desired position, will be appreciated with this car. The finished car is being filled with liquid oxygen for another test, again in the Haylant works. Notice the obvious degree of control the driver has over the rate of combustion, and consequently the speed, and also the small jet issuing from the rear. After this, the Nazis came into power, and were not slow to realize the immense potential of the rocket as the power unit of the future. Consequently, work in Germany was soon ordered to be carried on only under military supervision and conditions of great secrecy. Consider for a moment what progress has been made up to this point. Much experience in the use of solid fuel rockets, including the design of some for military purposes, has been obtained. An example of rocket armament on aircraft has been seen. A rocket-propelled aircraft has made its first flight. Liquid fuel rockets based on liquid oxygen have been developed to a considerable extent, and have already proved superior to the solid fuel rockets for the propulsion of the car you saw in the last scenes. Moreover, much experience in handling liquid oxygen and designing components for use with it has been accumulated. A start has been made on small-scale rockets for high-altitude and long-range employment. These were eventually to be developed into the V2 under the direction of von Braun. In the period after 1934, not only were considerable strides made in solid-fuel rockets, not only were liquid oxygen rockets brought to an advanced state of development, but in addition, self-igniting liquid rockets based on hydrogen peroxide and on nitric acid had been worked out. Much of the progress in rocket motors was due to their development of the bi-fuel liquid motor, in which two fuels are brought separately into the combustion chamber and ignite spontaneously on mixing. One of the most satisfactory combinations is of Seystoff and T-Stoff. Here is some Seystoff, a hydrazine hydrate rocket fuel developed in Germany, and here some T-Stoff, concentrated hydrogen peroxide, is being dropped into it. This spontaneous combustion illustrates the principle of these bi-fuel liquid rocket motors. Concentrated hydrogen peroxide and similar oxidants making up these bi-fuel mixtures are somewhat dangerous to handle. Here some concentrated hydrogen peroxide is poured over textile material, which begins to burn almost immediately. In addition to the bi-fuel combination based on hydrogen peroxide, another most important combination is based on concentrated nitric acid. This picture shows two of these fuels igniting spontaneously when they come into contact with one another. One of them is concentrated nitric acid, and the other a specially developed mixture of chemicals known as amines. This is one of the Walter hydrogen peroxide assisted takeoff units used operationally during the war, the development of the earlier work just seen. Among other improvements, a parachute has now been added to recover the unit when jettisoned from the aircraft after use. When the fairings are removed, the unit is seen to be of compact design. Here is a section view of the assisted takeoff unit. The large spherical tank holds hydrogen peroxide. The smaller tank holds calcium permanganate, and these two are forced separately into the combustion chamber by means of compressed gas, led first through a pressure-reducing valve. They react spontaneously when they meet in the combustion chamber. All the operations necessary for using such an ATO unit are now reviewed. After collection, the unit is first filled with compressed air at 160 atmospheres pressure. The two rocket fuels used in this particular assisted takeoff unit are concentrated hydrogen peroxide and calcium permanganate solution. Here the latter, also known as Z-Stoff, is being filled from a drum into 10 cans by means of a device which delivers the exact amount required for each assisted takeoff unit, 4.3 litres, into each can. This substance is not particularly dangerous, but the men are shown wearing protective clothing. Since two assisted takeoff units are being prepared for an aircraft, two of these filled cans are taken away. Here the permanganate solution is being filled into the ATO unit. Now the unit is brought up to be filled with concentrated hydrogen peroxide, which is run in from a special tank wagon after a measured amount, 96 litres, has first been pumped up into a reservoir. The men are again wearing protective clothing. This fuel is dangerous to handle, but if proper precautions and special equipment of this sort are used, the operation can be performed satisfactorily. The final operation is attachment of the parachute to the assisted takeoff unit. This is shown here, and the unit is now ready to be put on an aircraft. Here the unit is being wheeled up to a Heinkel 111, and one takeoff unit attached under each wing. The unit is lifted easily by 4 men from its special trolley. After attachment under the wing, the static cord to open the parachute, when it is subsequently jettisoned, is fixed. And finally, the unit is, so to speak, armed by opening the safety valve which previously shut off the high-pressure air. Now the aircraft takes off. The pilot switches on the takeoff units, causing a diaphragm in the air pipeline in the takeoff unit to break and allow compressed air to blow the fuel separately into the combustion chamber. When the aircraft is taken off, the rocket units are jettisoned and come down in a parachute for collection, to be used again. After collection, they are washed out by filling the tanks with water and blowing through with compressed air. In addition to using the assisted takeoff unit on land planes, it proved very useful in getting flying boats off the water. Here a rather larger takeoff unit is being ferried out to a Blohm & Voss 138 flying boat. This unit is a development of the one just seen and gives a thrust of 1500 kilograms for 30 seconds, the filled weight of the unit being 483 kilograms. Here these units are shown attached, one under each wing, no parachutes being included in this case. Here is the Blohm & Voss 138 flying boat taking off with the assistance of these rocket units. To give an impression of the value of assisted takeoff units, a takeoff with and without these rockets will now be shown. These tests were carried out on the same day and under the same sea and wind conditions in December 1940. This is the takeoff without rocket assistance. The all-up weight is 16.5 tons, and the time taken to become airborne is 43 seconds. For comparison, here is the exactly similar takeoff with the same all-up weight using one of these large rocket units under each wing. It will be obvious that the takeoff is greatly facilitated. In fact, the time taken is only 16 seconds. Thus, German flying boats from 1940 were capable of taking off with large overloads of petrol, and accordingly increased their range. Yet another interesting application of such rocket-assisted takeoff units is shown here. The large German transport glider, the Messerschmitt 321, is seen having two rocket units attached under each wing. Glider carries a tremendous load. For instance, two medium-sized tanks constitute a typical load. To take off such a heavy load on an unpowered glider, a towing operation with three Messerschmitt 110 twin-engined aircraft is undertaken. The cables to the aircraft are here being attached. Here is this interesting takeoff. The rocket units can be seen in operation under each wing. And finally, the glider becomes airborne.